My name is Neal Juern. I'm the CEO here at 7Tech. I asked one of our internal experts, he's actually the manager over our entire security operations center. So he's a busy guy and he's a very talented guy. Larry Harris is joining us. But this webinar is really geared for both IT professionals and business owners or executives. So there's content for both. We will be getting into some of the technical aspects, but I think if you're a business owner, you're going to enjoy seeing a lot of those things anyway. So you should get good value for both. This is really continuing a series that we're doing on advanced cybersecurity. And the reason we're doing that is it's part of our mission, and I'll talk about that. One of the things we're going to be providing right away is called an IT Pros Playbook. Part of that playbook is really sharing our internal secrets, what we do exactly with organizations that hire us to do cybersecurity. So really the how-to is just as important as the why, and we're going to try to cover both. To achieve sort of zero data breaches, and what I wanted you to know is in the last 4.5 years, I believe it's March, it will actually be 5 years, we've had no significant data breaches with any single client of ours. And when I say significant, what I mean by that is the only data breach that's been successful against any of our clients has been a few clients who did not turn on multi-factor authentication for Microsoft 365. Now, we advise every single client to do it. There are a few who just thought it was too inconvenient and they didn't do it. Those are the only ones that have had any type of data security issue across more than 70 clients, thousands of endpoints. So how is that even possible? How is it even possible across such a vast number of companies and endpoints, and we've had no significant data breaches? And we're going to tell you the nitty-gritty of how we've done it, of what we learned and what we've changed to really protect an organization from the latest cyber threats that are out there. A little bit about me. I actually started my IT career in enterprise IT. So I actually worked for a very large law firm that became a national law firm. About 10 of those years, I was an IT director, and there's actually quite a few IT directors on this webinar today. So I can relate to what your job is because I've had that same job, and you wear a ton of hats, and it's not an easy thing to do. So that's where I got started. I took a lot of what I learned in enterprise IT and really brought that to that small and mid-sized business so that they can be just as well protected as larger organizations. Just in the last year, I've been highlighted in magazines. I've spoken at Zero Trust World, which is a cybersecurity conference. I've actually also been part of what's called the Thought Leader program for MSP Success Magazine. MSP stands for Managed Services Provider, which we are one of. And so that's just all some recognition I've had in the last year. Just so you know who you're listening to. I'm not just some random guy. This is what I eat and breathe and do every day. Our company has earned a lot of awards. The credit really goes to our staff who's worked incredibly hard. There's a list of managed service providers that's worldwide called the MSP 501. We're competing against companies from Australia, Canada, all over the world for the top 501 companies, and we've landed in the middle of that list for the last 2 years in a row. So just a little bit about us. Our mission as an organization is to specialize in helping mid-sized companies with internal IT. You don't have to have internal IT, but we partner well with those organizations, protect their data, enhance their workforce, and really just stay productive and stay clean from all the hacking events that happen. And if you work in IT or you're a high-level executive, have you heard about this in the news? Take a look at these headlines here. The trend that we're seeing in the last 2 years is that both high-level executives and security professionals that work in internal IT are actually being held personally liable if data is stolen, especially if it's data that's stolen on their customers, their employees, people in the public. And the sad part is you could be the victim of a cyber attack and then you're blamed for it and then you're held liable. So changes have to be made. Internal IT has to do a better job. Companies like us have to do a better job to really prevent this kind of thing from escalating any further. You work in IT, for those of you who are IT pros on the webinar today, we know how it is. I mean, I've been in that position. We know the work that high-level management sees is just the tip of the iceberg, and there's so many responsibilities that fall underneath your job description, and most people don't even fully understand what you do. So we get it. That's the same world we live in as well. And our goal is just to equip you more so you can do your job better. Last webinar, we talked about threat detection. And really, it all starts with threat detection. We talked about how you can use something called a SIEM to collect all the threat information that's coming against your organization, take that information, and then take action against it. Without good threat detection, it's pretty hard to have threat prevention, right? It's hard to stop things you don't even know about. So it all starts there. If you didn't join us for that last webinar, I'd recommend you see if you can watch that online. That will really help you in your journey to have advanced cybersecurity. We talked about this on the last webinar as well. I'd love, Larry, if you could chime in on this and kind of the trend that we're seeing from the time an attacker actually breaks into an organization.
Absolutely. The software and the technology is always getting more sophisticated and automation's becoming more commonplace. There's a lot of tools out there that'll passively collect data, and then whenever attackers are getting ready to go on the offensive, they've already built up a large arsenal to use against an organization, and it takes much less time for them from the time of gathering data to executing and exfiltrating your data than ever before. It's a much more streamlined process than a lot of people would ever believe. And there's entire organizations dedicated to streamlining this malicious process.
Yeah, that's very well said. And it's just they've learned that the good guys like us have gotten better at detecting when there's hacker activity. So they've just shrunk that timeline down to where they break in and they launch their attacks very quickly. Look at this timeline. This is 15 days of hacking going back to October 31st to November 15th. So maybe less than 3 months ago. If you look at these organizations, these are multinational, multi-billion dollar organizations, all of them hacked within 15 days. It's really just gotten to a place where some people kind of have given up in a way. Like some people think it's inevitable that you can't stop everything. And there's some truth to that. But how is it that we who work with smaller organizations have had better success than they have? We're going to show you how. Every year sets a new record for cybercrime, and some of these things are just absolutely staggering. If you've never seen some of these statistics, one of the most interesting parts of this is that 2023, it actually looks like it's when they tally it all up, it's going to be more than 8 trillion. That's T trillion, just insanity. Um, if you took that number and you separated it out, it would be the third largest economy in the world. That's how much cybercrime is affecting the world. Far more than illegal drugs, human trafficking, all the money made on all of that. This dwarfs that. This is way beyond that. Look at these numbers. These just kill me. If you look in 2023, hackers were able to make basically worldwide $255,000 a second. It's just staggering. So with those staggering numbers, how do you feel about it? And post this in the chat. Do you think that it's a losing battle, that you can't stop these things, that it's gonna attack your business and there's nothing you can do about it? If you would post something in the chat where some of the answers are, it's a never-ending challenge. It is only a matter of time. And the reason that's true is there is no perfect prevention. You've always got to be evolving and getting better. So I like that. I like the answer that it's not a losing battle, but it's just the nature of it, and it's true as well. So I think it really boils down to all of us having this on the forefront of our minds and working hard at it, and you'll see that difference in your organization. I like this quote from a former FBI director, William Webster. He basically says, security is always too much until the day it's not enough. And nobody in your company is saying, oh, we just love all these security hoops we have to jump through to log in and do our job. Nobody says that, right? Let's add some more. Nobody said that. It's just all necessary, unfortunately. I remember this story, and I think this will hopefully resonate with some of you guys. There was this story about this young man who He takes the train every day to work, and he got up a little bit late, made it to the train, and as he was standing there, he realized, oh man, I missed that train. So he had 30 minutes to wait until the next train. And he kind of struck up a conversation with a man standing next to him. And when that happened, the person he was talking to was actually a doctor. And the doctor noticed on the young man's hand that on his fingernail, he had a dark patch underneath his fingernail. The young man had thought, oh, it's probably like one of those like bruises or whatever you might get under your fingernail. And the doctor said, you know what, you really need to go get that checked out. And interesting thing about the story is the young man did go get it checked out, and it actually was what's called subungual melanoma. It's a very deadly form of skin cancer. And the interesting thing about that was it was just a chance encounter that he ran into this doctor who told him to go get it checked out, and he did, and it really saved the young man's life. And the reason I tell you that story is just for you to know that this might be one of those encounters for you. Is something you learn today may be the thing that protects you and your organization from being that next statistic. So that's our hope, and we're going to try to make that give you the best value we can today. IT Pros Playbook. So look for that at the end. We're going to throw that link up there so you can download it. There are really three types of security assessments that we do as an organization. I want to kind of highlight each of these so you know what's what. We do a general security assessment, which a lot of times we do that one for free. It's not a huge time commitment for us, but it does give good value. We do that for free. That's the small one. The middle one there is called a full penetration test. I'm going to have Larry talk about how long each of these take here in just a second, but that is a lot more expensive. What we charge is actually pretty low. I was looking the other day at some of the bigger organizations and what they charge to do this. Many times it's like $30,000. I saw that posted on several websites yesterday. We charge about $12,000 to do one. We also do something called a mini penetration test. And I'm going to show you that here, actually. This is what's encompassed on a mini penetration test. It pulls down into 3 sections, and then the actual consultation and the reporting that goes along with it. The value that we place on each of those are these values. It's about $1,000 for us to do the general security assessment. It's a couple thousand to do a full vulnerability assessment. And then we do something called CIS benchmarking. And what that means is we're checking your systems against best practices from the Center for Internet Security. And it's a benchmark, and there's like 395 tests just for one computer, just to give you an example. So this is extensive. So Larry, tell us, how long does it take to do like the security assessment, the full penetration test, and the mini pen test, just so people know?
Yeah, so for the security assessment, you're looking at anywhere between 3 to 4 days just for us to get our eyes on the entire scenario that we're looking at, have a lot of input back and forth between us, and then we can make some judgments based off of that. The mini penetration test is roughly about a 1 week process. There are multiple agents that go into this scenario, and depending on the agent, sometimes they can take a couple of hours up to a day to run all of the tests that they need to. And the reason they take so little or so long is just based off the nature of them, and to have as little impact on your systems as possible. You should essentially not know that these tests are occurring on your computer because they're so lightweight. And that's why some of them take a little bit longer than others. They're designed to get as much information as possible, but to also be as non-intrusive as possible too. And for a full penetration test, that'll just come with a couple of custom caveats. Every environment's different. You have different networking, server devices, cloud infrastructure, and depending on that, it usually takes around 3 weeks. But we'll need to look at things like scope and amount of devices and applications in use and so on. So that one can fluctuate depending on what your environment looks like and what the surface of your digital footprint looks like.
Okay, we all know that email is still, 2024, the number one way people get hacked is still through email. Over 90% of hacking is still done through email. Did you know that of all globally, Microsoft's 365 customers, less than 20% of them have MFA turned on. Did you know that? That just blows my mind. We have, across our client base, we maybe have 1 or 2% that don't have it turned on, but almost everybody else does because it's just that important. It's amazing that that's still the case. If you look at what is it that actually gets in, how are the hackers getting in? What are the top 3 things? Number 1 is emails, as we just said. Number 2 are passwords, either stolen or cracked passwords. For those of you who are IT pros, you know about the dark web, you know that people can go out there and buy up, passwords that have been stolen. And then number 3 is vulnerabilities in your software and your devices. So we're going to cover how this relates to how you set up better threat prevention. There are also things like misconfigurations and insider threats. Those are less common, but still very real. We're just going to talk about the big 3. Microsoft was hacked back in late November, and they didn't announce it until January 12th. But I want to read this to you because this was right on the Microsoft blog website. It said, beginning in late November, the threat actor used a password spray attack to compromise a legacy non-production test tenant account, gain a foothold, and then use that account's permissions to access a very small percentage of Microsoft corporate email accounts, including members of senior leadership, employees in cybersecurity, legal. You get it. So what they did, they went into a test environment, which did not have MFA. They did password spraying, which is cracking, and they just threw passwords at it till they find one that worked. They cracked that account. They moved laterally into their production environment and then compromised senior leadership email accounts. That blows me away. I don't know. I don't even have words to say how they could allow that to happen. It's unbelievable. So to really get kicked off in bringing your threat prevention up to avoid what those kinds of things that just happened to like Microsoft, for example, we're going to talk about 7 layers. And a lot of these you guys know them or they make sense to you. Starting at the bottom, the physical layer is exactly what it sounds like. It's your physical devices. It's the actual, physical systems, switches, servers, all those things. Perimeter is most commonly associated with firewalls. Network is the network itself, like switches, Wi-Fi, access points, all those things. Endpoints are your workstations, your servers, your IoT devices. Applications are the applications you use every day. Some of those are line of business applications. Some of those are everyday applications like Word and Excel. Your data is your data. Maybe it's files stored on a file server. It could be data stored in a database. And then the users. And we're going to kind of break down how you can add threat prevention for the most important layers. When you look at this now, and we look back at the 3 most common ways that hackers get in, they roughly translate to these layers. Now, there's some overlap in these, but they roughly translate to the network, endpoints, applications, and users layers. And so we're going to talk about all the layers, but we're going to spend a little bit more time on those. So let's kick it off with, or actually before I do that, I'd like Larry to comment on this. What is really the benefit of doing all this work, Larry? Could you tell us?
Absolutely. The main benefit you'll get by reducing and doing all of this work in terms of making your organization better is minimizing the surface of attack, your attack surface for all of your organization combined in a technical aspect. The less visible your organization is to threat actors, the less they have to go based off of. So when you're thinking about this, it could be, how are people in my office accessing my files when they're working remotely? Do we have cloud infrastructure? Do we have a VPN? Do we have a public RDP server? Do we have applications that we host internally and are available to our employees when they're working remotely with no VPN? It's really what's in my office and in my cloud, and how is it accessible, and how can you minimize that? And it's coming at the cost of hopefully not making your employees' life harder. There's a lot of really good applications that we'll talk about later that help reduce your service area without complicating your network setup or making your employees' lives harder. But all of these are to shrink your attack surface. So when a threat actor is doing reconnaissance, they don't even see your company come up. You're just not even on the list of potential targets for them to look into.
If you think about it like an African safari, right? You've got, if you've ever watched some of those shows, those documentaries, and you see the pride of lions, I guess, the lions, and they're looking at the gazelles, and really what ends up happening, right? It's the slowest gazelles, it's the most exposed ones that they take down first. In the world of hacking, it's still true. So you don't want to be that slow gazelle. You want to have a very small attack surface, and you want to be kind of at the front of that pack, so that you're not the next victim, essentially. So let's kick it right off with layer one, physical security, physical layer. This is often overlooked by IT professionals. We get brought into organizations a lot, and we'll go do a site survey or something like that, and we'll see that things are just kind of wide open sometimes. You got server rooms with everyone has access to, or you've got network ports that I could just plug into anywhere in the organization and at least get an IP address and be on the network. So physical security, you don't want to overlook it. Now, in the playbook that we're providing, we go a lot deeper into this. We're not going to go as deep into this layer because it's not as exploited as some of the other layers, but it's still important. In the playbook, there's a lot of details in there, and there's action items on each of the layers. So I would encourage you, get the playbook and take action on each layer. This is one of them. If you have compliance requirements, like some of the well-known ones out there, HIPAA, CMMC, SOC, HITRUST, any of those, then you already have a long list of things you need to be doing for physical security in order to pass audits. So this shouldn't be new to you, or if you know that you're stepping into needing compliance, then get ready and go check out the playbook, because it's got exactly most of the things you need to do in it already. Let's jump into layer two, the perimeter layer. And when you think about the perimeter, most of us think about firewalls, right? That's pretty much what most people think about. But it's really, there's this old example of perimeter security that's a castle with a moat, right? And the firewall is kind of like almost like a drawbridge where you're kind of selectively letting in and out what you want. Um, you know, why doesn't this model work anymore? If we could get some answers in the chat, I'd love to hear, why is this not the correct model anymore? I'm going to give you my reasoning behind it. The reason why kind of that castle and moat kind of analogy of cybersecurity doesn't work anymore is the firewall is really only protecting the edge, right? Um, the firewall is really only protecting the edge of the network. It's not really actively protecting all the devices inside the network, or more importantly, the devices outside of the network. So really the answer is the perimeter is dead. The perimeter as we know it doesn't exist anymore. And the main reason behind that is the explosion of remote work. Now, some of us still have organizations where everyone's kind of behind a firewall, and you're still all within that, in that kind of four walls, but more and more that's not the case. And you can't pretend like the firewall is all you need, because it's not. You've got to bring that protection all the way down to the endpoint. You got to treat the endpoint as the perimeter. And so the trend that you're seeing is the perimeter has moved from the perimeter up to actual endpoints, the devices themselves. And it's a much better strategy for protecting your organization than just relying on something out on the edge to do that. Layer three, the network itself. When we're talking about the network, we're talking about switches, we're talking about access points, but we're also talking about the software that makes that network work, like the Windows Active Directory, which is a directory service, for example. You've got that software that provides resource sharing, it provides communications, it provides identity access, right, or authentication. So that's what we're talking about when we talk about the network layer. It's that combination of both the physical and the software that create security. What you need to know about the network layer, and one of the most important kind of cybersecurity rules, is proper network segmentation. A lot of times we're brought into organizations and they're kind of have a flat network or everything's in one network. And the danger of that is if one thing gets attacked, it's successfully on that network, then hackers can move laterally because everything's kind of in one space. So the more you can segment that logically to fit things like departments and where there's risk, the better off you are. So that way, if something does get attacked, you're isolating it to more of an area than an entire organization. This can be done using something called VLANs on switches, or you can use actual firewalls between network segments as well. Next up is network hardening. Network hardening is the practice of changing the default security settings on systems, specifically like Windows and things like that, to something more secure so you can actually prevent attacks. Kind of as you would imagine when you stick a Windows machine into an environment, the default settings are pretty loose because they're really designing it for interoperability, not for security. So we're going to show you a way that you can really make a huge difference on this in your environment. And we talked about this on the last webinar, actually. For those of you who run Windows Active Directory internally, there's a tool called Ping Castle. You can go to their website and notice what it says here is get Active Directory security to 80% in 20% of the time. And so I'm actually going to have Larry share his screen for a moment and show you kind of what Ping Castle results look like. There's some details on this in the playbook as well. But I want you to just see what the results look like and kind of what the actions are, how you can take action using this tool.
So this is just an example test environment that we ran Ping Castle on. There's a lot of accounts in here. There's a lot of computers attached to it. And the first thing you'll see when you run a report is just a gauge score. And it just tells you where you sit across the board. And the main three categories it's going to file everything into is how old is everything and how unused is your Active Directory environment. That's really going to give you an idea of the last time it was updated and upkept. Do you have a lot of disabled accounts? Do you have a lot of accounts that have not been signed into in over, 60, 90 days, 1 year plus? The number of privileged accounts you have in your environment, this should really be minimized just to what you need for operational success and audibility. And then if you're working in an environment where you have more than one domain, you're a multi-tenant domain Active Directory system, maybe you're operating under different company names, or you have more than one network that you're working in inside of Active Directory, this can pop up in here. And then anomalies. This is really all the security aspects that it's looking at and detecting what you should go change from some of those default values, or maybe some default values that have been changed to even be less secure. And it'll assign a risk model based off of everything that it's found. It's running multiple checks through each one of those sections, and it'll highlight them based off of the score that you're receiving. So if we take a look into some of these example sections, this is the stale objects. So in a couple of these sections, you can see number of accounts that have never expiring passwords. Maybe you're an organization that uses a lot of service accounts. Maybe try to minimize those or give them the most least privileges possible instead of having multiple service accounts with domain admin privileges, and then duplicate accounts and inactive accounts, just stale accounts and computers that can be removed from your Active Directory network. And then some things like privileged accounts. Do you have admins that are inactive that can probably be removed? And then protected users, and similarly accounts with non-expiring passwords. These are all things that it's going to look at and that you should be monitoring at least on a quarterly cycle. That way you're going through and you know that your domain is up to snuff and you don't have anything you have to be worried about sitting out there. And you can also make a plan of action to reduce some privileges on certain accounts, maybe service accounts or employees that have left after a little bit of time. If you do have trust, this section will be a little bit different because there's separate ways that this can work if you're operating with multiple domains. And then really here in the anomaly section, this is where you'll see some of the security rules. So Kerberos password, this is what's used in a golden ticket exchange attack. Basically, there's one golden ticket for all of Active Directory, where if you have it, you can log into your domain controllers. This can be manually changed and reset, and there are instructions and some references to guides inside of the playbook that we're going to give out. But this should essentially be changed every now and then until it's not on the default Microsoft setting and changed yearly if possible. And then it'll go into some other security issues like TLS. If you're using outdated applications, maybe it'll give you an insight into what some of those are so you can go ahead and either work with the software vendor to upgrade those, or maybe even find different, more secure solutions that support modern encryption and authentication and authorization. So,
Nice, nice. Very cool tool that we've been using for years with clients. So thanks for showing us that, Larry. Let me share my screen again. And one fair warning with Pingcastle is it's going to have some recommendations that, like TLS is the one he just pointed out, that if you want to be careful and don't just immediately change your security settings before you understand what they're going to do, because you could actually render some areas of your organization kind of, you could stop production. Let's just say that. So just take your time with it. If you're unsure about a certain setting, do some testing and be ready to revert those changes just in case. Majority of what you're going to get, especially like with stale accounts and all that, that's actionable. You can kind of start taking advantage of right away. Some of the more technical things, when it gets into outdated protocols, you just want to be a little bit careful with that. All right. Also with the network layer, a common problem that we see is device updates that are not being done, or patches are not being applied to things like switches, access points, and so on. So you really want to be on top of that. We often see that there's sometimes organizations we are brought into that they've never had any of them done. And it's a huge vulnerability. It's pretty easy to crack some of those devices when they've never had any patches. Moving on to layer 4, which is endpoints, and that's your workstations, your servers, your IoT devices. And here is our secret. If you wanted to know the secret, this is it. It's using a zero trust strategy with endpoints. And we're actually going to show you one of the tools we use that has been huge in this area. What is not a zero trust solution? Let's talk about that for a second. You've got antivirus is not zero trust. Antivirus is looking for known bad things. It's not, so it assumes everything's good unless it shows itself to be bad. So that's not zero trust. VPN is not zero trust. VPN, if anyone has the right username, password, or credentials, it assumes once they're connected that all that traffic should just be allowed back and forth. So not zero trust. And firewalls themselves are not zero trust. They're just looking for bad things as well to block. So those are not examples of a zero trust strategy. ThreatLocker is one of the tools we use. And if you see this, and we're going to show you a quick demo of ThreatLocker, if you see this and you think it's right for your environment, reach out to us. There are 7 global ThreatLocker Gold partners worldwide, only 7 in the world, and they have thousands of clients. And we're one of those 7. So we've been a client of theirs for a really long time. We believe in their product, and it has solved a really important problem for us. So we want to show you what it can do just kind of briefly. This is sort of the tip of the iceberg, but what it's basically doing is flipping the whole narrative on its head and saying, we're gonna assume that nothing is trusted except what we allow to trust. So let me stop sharing again and have Larry show you what that looks like.
so what you guys are looking at right now, this is just a Windows server that's running a couple of normal services. It has networking with other devices. It has a couple of custom applications that have been configured on it. And also the most important piece, ThreatLocker, to help secure it. And what we have right here on the desktop is two different installers. One for Firefox, which has been pre-approved inside of a policy we have in our tenant. And then Nmap. This is a common reconnaissance and attacker tool. A lot of security experts and a lot of malicious actors use the same tools. This one is network mapping, and also it has a scripting engine in it to automatically exploit some of the network vulnerabilities it detects. And the first thing we'll do is run this potentially malicious executable on here. And immediately, what you're going to see is a pop up that says, I don't have permission to run this. And then in the bottom right, you'll see a pop up from ThreatLocker with the name of the executable that tells me that it's been blocked. ThreatLocker works on a Microsoft security driver, which means it's integrated in the actual Windows operating system kernel. That's a very special process you have to go through as a security company to get into that Microsoft program. And essentially, what that means is ThreatLocker's looking at the hash of the program, your certificate, the path of execution, and the authenticity of the files to make a decision whether to run it or not at the kernel level of the operating system. So it's very well integrated into your system, and it's very fast. This device also has antivirus on it. And what we'll know is that none of the antivirus has even been triggered or popped up on the computer, simply because ThreatLocker is blocking the file from even being able to be executed or installed. There's just no rule set up for it to allow this hash, this certificate from this software vendor, or this path of execution. And then if we were to click on Firefox here, you'll notice that immediately it will start to install this software. There is no delay that's humanly discernible when you're going through steps like this. These are happening in milliseconds to nanoseconds on a modern computer in terms of speed. And then you'll be able to utilize software that you have pre-approved, deploy it to as many computers as you want. And now this software is allowed to run, and we can open up Firefox and continue on browsing. But this software here will continue to be blocked indefinitely until, if it's something legitimate, we can request access to our professional team, or we can just continue to block it and even silence notifications if it's something that your team just doesn't need to be using, essentially.
Nice. So I hope you saw the power of that, because it's really game-changing technology for endpoints, and it's a true zero trust solution. One of the things that it's doing is that you might not have noticed is, in many organizations out there, you probably are the same. None of your users are local administrators of their machine, or they probably don't have permission to install things on their computers. But that doesn't prevent them from running executables. So like Nmap just being an executable, or something like Nessus, those are just executables. So they don't need permission to install them to run them. So that's what hackers are relying on. Hackers are relying on the fact that they have enough permission to run a piece of software that doesn't need to be installed, that can do all the damage they need to do. So keep that in mind, that just because they're not local administrators of the machine doesn't mean that antivirus is gonna help you at all. ThreatLocker will. So anyway, if you know you need a solution like that, which we do recommend, talk to us about it. We can give you a more in-depth demo on ThreatLocker, but it is game-changing technology. Moving on, and there's some blurring between layer 4, the endpoints layer, and layer 5, the applications layer. And what we mean by that is, ThreatLocker also protects applications, as you just saw. But what you're going to see is, there's more to it with applications that you have to be worried about. And when we're talking about applications, we're really talking about things like the everyday applications like Word, Excel, but also your line of business applications. So you may have a custom application or something that's specific to your business. That's what we're talking about here. What is really important about applications is there are ways to secure applications that really people don't sometimes aren't strict enough about. And I saw one of the comments in the chat earlier about I'll scroll up to find that. It was Stephen was saying, hey, I hate MFA, and we're not fans of it either. We do it because it's necessary. But here's an example of, if you have line of business applications and they have MFA, you should have that turned on, because now that's the closest a hacker can get to your actual proprietary data is your line of business applications. So if they have MFA or 2FA, make sure that's enabled. Another thing is really controlling who has access to those applications using good security for identity, right? And then the third thing is something called ZTNA. If you're using a traditional VPN today, how do you get zero trust for applications? One is something called ZTNA, which means you're just allowing them to access sort of the interface of the applications. They don't have full access to the files, the server, all of that. So it's a different way. They could remotely connect in and run the application, but they're not actually having direct access to it. So it's a different way to think about that. Let's move on. And well, actually, before I do that, let me say this. ThreatLocker has a feature that works with applications that is really cool called ring fencing. What that means is, let's use an example of Microsoft Word. You have Microsoft Word probably on most of your systems out there. For most users, Microsoft Word itself does not need to be able to go to the internet, download files, run scripts, do all those things. Well, hackers create macros for Microsoft Word all the time, and then they'll just con your users into running a Word macro that goes to the internet, downloads files, runs executables. So if Word doesn't need to be able to do that, you can, with ThreatLocker, you can turn that off, and you can ring fence it and say, Word needs to create documents, it needs to do everything Word's supposed to do, but it shouldn't be participating in all those other activities. That severely limits what a hacker could potentially do with already approved and installed applications. So think about that. It's very powerful. So let's move on to layer 6, the data layer. This is not one of the layers that we said was most important, but what is most important about the data layer, and the biggest mistake that we see, is people not following the principle of least privilege. And I think it's because sometimes IT professionals are a little bit lazy and they would just rather give people more permissions than they need than really set up those permissions in a granular way. The principle of least privilege says you should only have enough permissions to do what you need to do every day, and that's it, no more. So it takes extra work, but it's exactly what hackers are hoping you won't do. They're hoping you won't take the effort to set up the permissions correctly so that when they gain access to that user's computer, they have more access than they should, and they can exploit that. Here's an example of 2 people, and these are on this webinar today, that are often set up incorrectly. CEOs or high-level executives and IT people like yourselves, like a lot of you, is many of you have an account that has all access and you use that as your everyday account. We call that your daily driver account. Oftentimes CEOs will also say, like myself, I might say, hey, give me access to everything because I don't want to be bothered with requesting access to anything. This is a huge mistake. And the way it should be is that you actually have, each of these important users should have 2 accounts. I am a CEO and I have 2 accounts. This account that I'm logged in with right now has absolutely no permissions to anything. Like I use this every day, and all I get is just enough access to access the files I need, the internet, all of that. I don't have any administrative privileges. I have a separate account for that, which is a high security password, has MFA on it, all of that. So, so just know that you really have to have, you know, 2 accounts for people that need those high-level permissions, including IT professionals. And IT professionals should do the same thing. They should have their everyday account, which is the account they use for all of their communications, their email, Teams, all those internet communications should be done with your everyday account. And your high-level administrator account would be the one you use for things like setting permissions and creating users and all that. And don't use that for communications. This is paramount, and it's in the guide. It's one of the action items, is to make sure you have multiple accounts. Layer 7 is user education, and users or user education or security awareness training, which is often a sore spot for a lot of us IT professionals. It's not always easy to get people to engage with that. This quote really says it the best, is amateurs hack systems, but professionals hack people. And so we know that social engineering is still one of the main ways that these high-level hacker groups get in, is they just con users into giving them the access. They're not doing anything super sophisticated. They're not breaking in with a cracked password, or they're not exploiting a vulnerability. They're just exploiting people. And if you can do that, you've got all the access you need. And so we have to teach our users about how to be skeptical and take that element of trust that they probably have in the real world, where they want to trust people. And when it comes to an online world, they got to go to more of a zero trust approach, and don't trust, and have people verify their identity, verify what they are requesting is actually valid. So how can you do that? How can you get your users engaged? Here's 3 ways. Continuous training. You've got to do it. They need to be aware. Online classes, but not only online. If you can get people together into groups, make some fun events about it. We have some details about this in the guide as well. Don't teach them how to hack anything. We actually had a client who wasn't our client at the time, who their internal IT person held one of these in-person events and then taught them how to spoof email addresses and do low-level hacking things. Don't teach them that. Just teach them what to look for and how to prevent those things. Number 2, establish a cybersecurity culture. And that's really talk to your teams about the latest scams. Get them to tell you about the latest scams that they've seen. And you, as the expert, you can be there to help guide them through that and apply it to what they're doing in your organization every day. And then regularly test and assess. We use tools that phish our users, right? So we're sending, phishing emails to them, and we're testing to see if they fall for those, and then providing remedial training. A lot of you may have tools similar to that, and you need those. But also periodically just test them with questions, and with maybe, again, getting them into small groups. Have a list of questions. For the people who answer those questions correctly, give them some sort of small prize or notoriety, and you kind of get the engagement really high on this. And really the bonus is frequently test your threat prevention layers. You can go and make all these improvements to your threat prevention, but if you don't test, you don't know if they're working, right? You'll find out 2 ways if your threat prevention is working. Number 1, if you hire a third party to really help you test and check. Or number 2, if the hackers break in, then you'll know it didn't work. Your threat prevention didn't work. And number 2 is a lot more expensive than number 1. You're much better off hiring some experts to help you test and fix all the issues than to find that out when hackers break in, right? So keep that in mind. I saw one of the comments earlier that talked about that cybersecurity and IT is not a profit center, and it's true, but it's just a necessary lifeblood of what runs the business. Without technology, there is no business. There are really very few businesses today that run without technology. Maybe like a ice cream truck or something. I'm drawing a blank, but there's very few. So it's very important. So kind of summarizing, we went through the 7 steps. We provided you some tips on how you can improve each of those 7 layers. And I saw your comment there, Gus, earlier about access is perceived as power. I do understand that as well. And if you, I think what you got to do is you get that highest level person like me, a CEO, you get them on your side and give them to give up their access and they'll set the tone to help the rest of your organization to set a good example. I'm literally sitting here with an account that can do nothing. I can do nothing on the domain, no privileges, nothing. And that's the way I do it every single day, because it's the right thing to do. This is the link to get the playbook, so you can get it on that QR code. We'll hopefully see you on the next webinar. Thank you.